It started with a rusted wheelbarrow, a forgotten corner of the world, and a boy whose name was rarely remembered by anyone except his mother and maybe the old peanut vendor 2 blocks down. But this story doesn't begin in tragedy. It begins with a moment so ordinary, most people would walk past it without blinking. A boy standing on a hot, dusty street corner, selling roasted groundnuts while traffic roared by and chaos danced in the background. But sometimes the world's most extraordinary stories are born in the middle of everyday struggle. And on this day, something happened that would change 2 lives forever, and maybe change how you see people forever too. Because this isn't just about poverty or dementia or fate, it's about character. It's about what you choose to do when no one is watching. Raymond was 16, skinny, sunburned with calloused hands and an old blue shirt that had seen better decades. His day was supposed to be like every other, balancing a wooden tray on his head, weaving through crowded bus stops, offering snacks to passengers. But today he noticed something strange. An old woman sitting on a concrete bench just beyond the intersection. Her clothes elegant but dusty, her expression vacant, her body rigid, like she'd been waiting a long time, longer than anyone should when he first saw her. He thought maybe she was waiting for a ride. Then maybe she was confused. Then he saw her again the next day in the same place, and again on the third day. And this time Raymond knew something wasn't right. This is where most people turn away. They assume someone else will help. They justify their indifference by saying it's not their business. But Raymond didn't look away. He approached gently, unsure of what to say, and asked Auntie, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" And she looked at him with eyes that once commanded boardrooms, but now struggled to remember what day it was, and said, "I'm waiting for my driver. But I think he's lost." And with that one sentence, everything became clear. She was lost not just geographically, but mentally, emotionally disconnected from the world around her. And yet no one had stopped. No one had asked. No one had cared, except a boy with nothing to offer, but a wheelbarrow and a heart full of empathy. And this is where it gets powerful, because you have to understand the context. Raymond was poor. His home was a single room shared with 4 siblings. His days were about survival, not charity, but he didn't hesitate. He ran to borrow a wheelbarrow from a nearby mechanic, pushed it back, and said, "Auntie, maybe I can help you find home." And this next part might sound like fiction, but it's based on truths I've seen in the world. When desperation meets compassion, you get stories that defy expectation. Raymond didn't know where she lived. She didn't know where she lived. He simply started asking questions, showing her streets, neighborhoods, buildings, trying to jog her memory as they moved through the town, and people stared. Some laughed. Some called it foolish. Some thought he was stealing from her. But Raymond kept going, pushing that wheelbarrow over potholes, up inclines, through sun and heat for over 3 hours, until something in her eyes flickered with recognition. A faded mansion behind iron gates, covered in dust and vines, but still regal in its bones. She whispered, "That's it. That's my house." And Raymond wheeled her to the gate, unsure of what would happen next. The guards at first were stunned. They hadn't seen her in days. No one had known where she was. And here was a boy from the streets returning her without asking for anything. And this moment deserves pause, because it shows us something we too often forget. Value doesn't come from what you own, but what you give. And sometimes the poorest among us are the richest in spirit. And as the house staff gathered in shock and confusion, Margaret, as the woman was called, stood and held Raymond's hand and said softly, "Come back tomorrow. I want to thank you properly." And Raymond, unsure if she meant it, just nodded and left. And if the story ended there, it would already be remarkable, a tale of selflessness, of street smarts, of moral clarity. But it didn't end there. It was only beginning, because when Raymond returned the next morning, he didn't find resistance or scolding. He found opportunity. Margaret sat him down not as a servant but as a guest, and asked him to tell her his story. And when he did, she listened, really listened in a way few adults had ever done. And then she offered him a job, not because she pitied him, but because she saw something in him: strength, honesty, kindness, the things you can't fake. And this is important to understand. Not all opportunities are given as charity. Some are given as investment. She wasn't giving him a favor. She was placing a bet on a soul that had already proven itself. And that is something real wealth can recognize even when memory fades. And what unfolded next was the beginning of a bond that would shatter class assumptions, reveal deep family betrayal, and eventually turn a wheelbarrow boy into one of the most respected men in the city. And all because he answered the call of someone the world had forgotten. The next day, when Raymond stepped through the rusted gate of Margaret's estate, he didn't come with demands or expectations. He came with humility, the same boy in the same shirt still smelling faintly of roasted groundnuts and dust, but now stepping into a space that once hosted banquets and executive board meetings, and that contrast was striking: the marble floors, the towering glass windows, the manicured hedges that had started to overgrow. And yet, despite all that wealth, something about the house felt hollow, like luxury without laughter had left an echo instead of a home. Margaret was sitting in a wide sunroom, sunlight pooling around her like a gentle spotlight. And when she saw Raymond, her eyes lit up, not with recognition of his name, which her dementia made unreliable, but with recognition of his spirit. And this moment right here is where so many stories of class divide begin to fracture. Because here was a woman who had grown up on private jets, sat on boards of directors, signed contracts, worth millions, and she was asking a poor teenage boy to sit and talk to her as an equal. Raymond, though a nervous, obliged, he told her about his mother who sold a car by the roadside and raised 5 kids alone. His father who died when he was 7, the way he never finished school because he had to work to feed his younger siblings. And when he spoke, he didn't dramatize it or ask for sympathy. He just spoke like someone who'd grown used to surviving by telling the truth. And Margaret listened. She really listened. Not like someone waiting to speak, but like someone who understood what it meant to be unheard. And when he finished, she said one sentence that changed everything. "I trust you more than I trust anyone else in this house." And you might wonder why a wealthy old woman with decades of experience would trust a boy she barely knew. But here's the thing. Dementia may cloud memories, but it rarely dulls instinct. And Margaret had lived long enough to sense sincerity when it sat across from her. And in Raymond, she saw the honesty her world had long forgotten. She offered him a job on the spot, not as a cleaner or errand boy, but as her personal assistant. She said, "I need someone to help me remember." And Raymond nodded slowly, unsure if he was dreaming. And this is where the story begins to deepen. Not in a Cinderella way, but in a very human way. Because what started as a job quickly became a relationship of mutual transformation. Margaret needed someone who wouldn't treat her like glass, and Raymond needed someone who saw more in him than just poverty, and day by day, they began to change each other. Raymond helped Margaret take her medicine, reminded her of what day it was, labeled the kitchen cupboards with colorful sticky notes to help her navigate the house. Margaret in return gave him books, taught him etiquette, introduced him to music he'd never heard before, and slowly began to refer to him in softer tones. Not just my assistant, but my boy. And that phrase mattered not because of ownership, but because of closeness. And in a world where Raymond had always been the outsider, he was now being brought into a space that saw him as worthy, not for what he had, but for who he was. But not everyone was pleased with this new arrangement, especially not Margaret's relatives who had long hovered around her estate, like vultures waiting for her condition to worsen so they could claim their slice of her fortune. They saw Raymond as a threat, and interloper, and they began to whisper to staff, make veiled comments in front of her, and even planted doubts in her mind. But here's what they didn't understand. Margaret had seen betrayal before, in boardrooms, in marriages, in contracts disguised as partnerships, and Raymond's loyalty was clearer than any legal document. He never stole from her, never lied about where he'd been, and even when no one was watching, he always returned with the exact change when sent on errands. And Margaret tested this. She left her jewelry box unlocked on purpose once, left envelopes of cash on the hallway table. And Raymond always either returned them or never touched them. And it's those quiet tests that matter more than public declarations. Because real character is what you do when no one is clapping, and real love is what you build in those invisible moments of trust. And then one day a new threat emerged. A slick young man claiming to be a financial advisor, hired by one of Margaret's distant nieces. He told Raymond that Margaret had signed documents she didn't remember signing, and that he needed access to her personal files to straighten out the confusion. And Raymond listened, nodded, then politely refused, and later told Margaret, who laughed a dry laugh, and said, "They've started early, haven't they?" And it was then she made another decision, one that would send shockwaves through her family. She called her lawyer, asked him to draft a new will, and named Raymond her legal successor, not just to the estate, but to the philanthropic trust she had set up decades earlier. And this moment wasn't about money, it was about legacy. She told her lawyer, "This boy didn't just push me home. He reminded me of what home means, and I want him to carry that forward." And when the will was read privately for the first time, Raymond understood what she saw in him. And it wasn't pity, it was purpose. And in real life, this happens more often than we realize. Stories emerge every year of billionaires leaving fortunes to their drivers, or caretakers, or barbers. And while people scream scandal, the truth is those people often showed up when no one else did. And that's what Margaret honored. Not blood, but presence. Not obligation, but choice. Raymond didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He didn't even tell his mother right away. Instead, he went to the backyard of the mansion, sat under the big mango tree, and cried. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was seen. As the weeks passed, a rhythm settled into the mansion, one built not on hierarchy, but on humanity. And while Margaret's memory continued to play tricks on her, there were more good days than bad. And on those days, she would tell stories from her youth about how she built her first business when banks refused her loans, how she negotiated contracts while 9 months pregnant, how she once fired an entire board when they tried to silence her voice. And Raymond listened to every word, soaking it in, not just as history, but as strategy. Because for the first time in his life, someone was teaching him not just how to survive, but how to shape a future. And this is where the story shifts from kindness to transformation. Because Margaret wasn't content with just naming Raymond in her will. She wanted him to be ready, so she hired tutors to come to the house every week, experts in finance, public speaking, law, and literature. And at first, Raymond resisted. He wasn't used to studying in silence or reading for hours. He was more comfortable navigating crowded streets than academic texts. But something inside him had been awakened, a hunger to grow, a belief that maybe he was capable of more than selling peanuts under the sun. And that shift is everything, because the most powerful change doesn't come from being saved. It comes from being believed in, and Margaret did more than believe. She invested in him with the same energy she once gave to startups and CEOs. And slowly Raymond began to change, not just in knowledge, but in posture, in voice, in vision. He started writing in a journal, reflecting on ethics, on justice, on legacy. And one night, as Margaret sat beside the fireplace, sipping tea, she asked him, "What scares you most?" And he answered without thinking, "Becoming like the people who ignored you." And that answer sealed something between them, because it wasn't just gratitude, it was integrity. And while their bond deepened, so did the resentment of Margaret's family, who began visiting more often now, pretending to care, bringing flowers, pretending to be concerned. Margaret saw right through them, but she played along, amused by their sudden interest. And one afternoon, after one particularly forced visit, she looked at Raymond and said, "Wealth is a magnifying glass. It reveals what's already in you, and they're just proving who they've always been." And Raymond nodded quietly, knowing she was right, because every interaction with the family came with veiled insults, fake smiles, and quiet threats. And then came the moment of confrontation. One of Margaret's nephews caught Raymond alone in the hallway and said, "You think she'll actually leave it all to you? She forgets your name half the time, but you better believe the lawyers won't." And Raymond didn't react with anger or fear. He just said, "You've had your chance for years and did nothing. I won't apologize for showing up when it mattered." And that response echoed in the hallway longer than any threat could. And when Margaret heard about it later, she laughed and said, "If only I had 10 more like you." And she began involving Raymond more directly in the affairs of her trust, letting him sit in on meetings with advisors, allowing him to ask questions, challenge plans. And she told everyone who doubted him, "He's not replacing me. He's continuing me." And that distinction is critical, because so often people view succession as displacement, but Margaret saw it as evolution. And Raymond wasn't trying to erase her legacy, he was trying to embody it. And that's the kind of mentorship that changes not just lives, but generations. And here's a real-world parallel to this story. I once read about a young man from South Africa who was mentored by a retired judge, after helping him fix a flat tire. The judge saw potential in the boy, sponsored his education, mentored him through law school, and years later the boy became a human rights lawyer defending vulnerable communities. And when asked why he dedicated his career to justice, he simply said, "Because someone saw me when no one else did." And that's what Margaret did for Raymond. She didn't just open a door. She handed him the keys and said, "Build your own house." And that's exactly what he began to do, quietly, purposefully, and all the while caring for Margaret not out of duty, but devotion. When her memory would slip and she'd forget what day it was or who had called, he never corrected her harshly. He would sit with her, gently walk her back to the moment. And sometimes when she called him by the wrong name, he'd smile and say, "It's okay. I'm here." And over time, the staff who once sneered began to soften too, because they saw how consistent he was, how he treated the old woman, not like a task, but like a mother. And slowly the house changed, no longer just a monument to wealth, but a living, breathing home filled with laughter, warmth, and dignity. And that's what real transformation looks like. It's not in the headlines, it's in the hallway, conversations, in the late night tea, in the steady presence of someone who chooses to stay. And that's the key word here, chooses, because Raymond had options. Now he could have left, taken his inheritance, and run, but he stayed. And in staying, he showed that love is not what you say. When things are easy, it's what you do when no one expects it. And Margaret felt that even on days when she forgot where she was or mistook the television for a window, she always remembered one thing: Raymond made her feel safe. And in a world that once tried to define him by what he lacked, he was now defined by what he gave. And what he gave was everything: time, patience, loyalty, and most of all, love, the kind that doesn't shout but stays quiet in the corner, holding your hand until the fog lifts again. The day Margaret passed away was quiet, not dramatic, not filled with chaos or flashing lights, but soft, like the final chapter of a book that knows it has said everything it needs to say. The house felt still even before the news came, as if it understood before anyone else that something precious was about to be released into memory. Raymond was the one who found her just after sunrise. He had come to check on her, like he always did, tea in hand, hopeful she might be lucid enough to chat or share a few laughs about the news. But she was still, her eyes closed, her body peaceful, as if she had simply gone to sleep with no fear, no confusion, just rest. And as Raymond stood beside her bed, he didn't cry at first. He just sat down, held her hand, and whispered, "Thank you." And that two-word prayer carried more weight than any eulogy ever could, because Raymond wasn't just saying goodbye to a benefactor. He was saying goodbye to the only person who had seen his full worth before anyone else had ever looked. Close enough, and now he had to carry that legacy, not just in her name, but in his life. The house was soon filled with distant relatives, again the ones who had ignored Margaret for years now, swarming with their fake grief dressed in black, making calls to lawyers even before the body had been moved. But Raymond wasn't worried anymore, not because he was arrogant, but because he knew Margaret had made everything clear. Her new will left the estate in a trust managed by Raymond, with specific allocations for charities, education programs, and elderly care centers, inspired by her own experience with memory loss. And before the vultures could even open their mouths, her lawyer read the document aloud. And when Margaret's voice played in a pre-recorded video, her final message, the room froze. She said simply, "If you're here today hoping to get rich, I hope you walk away richer in humility, because the boy you once dismissed has shown me more humanity than all your bank accounts combined." And with that, every argument evaporated, and for the first time, Raymond stood not as the boy who pushed a wheelbarrow, but as the man who now held the future in his hands. And it wasn't a fairy tale. There were challenges, critics, rumors from the jealous ones, but Raymond stayed grounded. He didn't move into a luxury apartment or buy flashy cars. Instead, he began working to expand Margaret's foundation, creating outreach programs for at-risk youth and starting a mobile clinic initiative for seniors with dementia in rural communities. He also went back to school, studying law part-time while managing the estate during the day. And it was hard, exhausting even. But every time he thought about quitting, he remembered Margaret's words. "I trust you," and those words lit the path forward. And here's where the story takes on its most powerful meaning. because Raymond didn't build a life that revolved around comfort. He built one around contribution, and in that way he honored her, not with plaques or parties, but with action. And here's a real story that mirrors his. In Ghana, a young man named Daniel once helped an elderly woman cross the road in a rainstorm. She later turned out to be the mother of a local judge. And because of that small act, Daniel was offered mentorship scholarships and later became a prominent advocate for elder care in his region. And he often said, "I didn't help her because I thought she could help me. I helped her because that's what you do." And Raymond would have said the same because his story wasn't about being discovered. It was about discovering who he could be through the act of giving. And as the years passed, Raymond became more than a philanthropist. He became a storyteller, often invited to speak at universities, NGOs, and community centers. And whenever he was asked, "How did this all begin?" he would smile and say with a wheelbarrow and a question that no one else had asked, "Are you okay?" And that line became part of his foundation's motto, because sometimes everything changes, not when you give an answer, but when you ask the right question in the right moment. And in his speeches, he never made himself the hero. He always brought Margaret into the center. He called her my second mother, the woman who forgot many things, but never forgot how to love. And in time, the public began to embrace that story. Her mansion was converted into a cultural center for elderly support named the Memory House, where art therapy, music gardens, and mentoring programs intersected, and inside the main hall there was a painting of a boy with a wheelbarrow and an old woman smiling softly as they walked down a dusty road towards something neither of them could see, but both believed in deeply and every time. Raymond saw that painting, he felt two things: gratitude and responsibility, because love given freely asks for nothing, but it inspires everything. And when he spoke at the opening ceremony of the Memory House, he said, "I didn't grow up with inheritance. I grew up with intention, and the difference is that inheritance is what people leave you when they die, but intention is what they plant in you while they live." And Margaret planted something in me that no amount of wealth could replicate. She made me see that service is not a step down. It's a step in the right direction. And those words hung in the air like scripture, because in a world addicted to status, Raymond had become a leader who bowed not out of weakness, but out of reverence. And as he walked through the halls of the center, he would often pause to speak with the seniors, remembering each one by name, telling jokes, listening to stories, and reminding them gently that their lives still mattered deeply. And when asked why he spent so much time there, instead of expanding globally or chasing fame, he would say simply, "This was where I was found. This is where I belong." And one afternoon, as he walked past the garden behind the center, he saw a young boy struggling to push a wheelchair through the gravel, and he stepped in, helped lift the wheels over the bump, and smiled at the boy. And in that moment, time folded back on itself, and he remembered what it felt like to be 16 with nothing but a wheelbarrow and a heart that refused to look away. And as he walked back toward the main building, he whispered under his breath, "Thank you, Auntie." And somehow he felt her whisper back, "I never forgot you, even when I forgot everything else."